Hello, and welcome to Instant Gratification. I'm Jed Wagman.
And I'm Summer Gamble. We're both BFI Film Academy Young Programmers, and we're delighted to introduce our event today at the 66th BFI London Film Festival.
We're very sorry to have to draw you away from Netflix or Amazon Prime right now. We know there's loads of great new shows on at the minute that you're probably keen to finish. But that's exactly why we wanted to create this panel, to talk through the rise of high-end TV and why it's captured our attention so much over recent years.
With such a growth in streaming and the way we consume shows, television is changing, which is why we're here now at a film festival discussing TV. It's been such a pleasure putting together this event for you, and without further ado, we'll hand over to our amazing host, Rowan Woods, and our amazing panelists to get the discussion started.
Hi, my name is Rowan Woods. I'm the series and episodic programmer for the BFI London Film Festival. Welcome to this Young Programmers panel, which will explore the current TV landscape and how the rise of streaming has impacted what we watch, when we watch it, and how we watch it. I'm joined by a brilliant panel of experts who'll dive into this topic with me. I'm going to ask them to say a little bit about who they are, what they do, and I'm also going to ask them what they're watching at the moment and what their favourite show of the year has been. So Hanna Flint, film critic and author of Strong Female Character. Hi, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yes, my debut book, which is kind of part memoir, part movie criticism, is out 29th, so it'll be out by the time this goes out. And I write for Empire Magazine, BBC Culture, Time Out, anywhere that will pay me, doing reviews about film and television, and particularly have a particular interest in genre TV, especially the superhero stuff and the Star Wars stuff. So no surprise that my favorite show at the moment is Andor. Loving the first 3 episodes, and I'd say my favorite TV show of the year would be Station 11, which is on Stars Play UK.
Great choices. So we're also joined by Oliver Lyttelton, screenwriter and creator of TV shows Cheaters and Wedding Season, which both aired this year. Ollie, hi, welcome. What have you been watching?
So I have been watching, I just finished The Baby, Sharon Robbins-Grace's show, which I really enjoyed. It's got a very distinctive and weird kind of vibe, but I was actually really moved by it by the end as well. And I think my favorite of the year is a Thai Pachinko, which is on Apple TV, which is absolutely gorgeous, sort of historical epic, and Big Boys on for Jack Rook's absolutely lovely sort of coming of age comedy.
Great. And Lisa Kerrigan, Senior Curator of Television at the BFI National Archive. So Lisa, first tell us what that means, and then tell us what you're watching and what's your favourite thing you've seen this year.
First of all, thanks for having me. So part of what I do involves selecting contemporary television for acquisition to the National Archive. So those programmes are then preserved as part of the National Collection. And I also care for our historical collections of over 1 million television programmes, mainly dating back to the 50s. So that's a lot of TV. At the moment, I'm looking forward to new episodes of Bad Sisters every week. And I'm always like a couple of episodes into about half a dozen things. So I'm also watching A League of Their Own and Am I Being Unreasonable as well. And my favorite programs of the year are probably, well, it started last year, but it finished into this year, so I think it counts. Yellow Jackets, and also the final series of Dairy Girls. So girls of the 90s, essentially.
Perfect. Lisa, you're particularly well suited, but I hope we will all talk about this a little bit, to think about how we'll take as our jumping off point the question of how TV has changed over the last 10 years. I think there has been a huge shift in what we watch, the way we watch it, how we watch it, and all of those things are interrelated. So we will get into the weeds in all of those things, but what I'm going to ask you all to do first is perhaps just pick one thing that you think has changed over the past 10 years in the way that we watch TV. Lisa, you start.
It's easy, really. It's viewing habits and streaming services. I mean, this year is the 10th anniversary of Netflix in the UK. And it's nearly hard to remember what it was like 10 years ago before we had these services and the type of access that we do now. It's really transformed how audiences engage with television and how they think about it on a day-to-day basis.
Great. We will definitely come back to that and dig into that a little bit more. Ollie.
I mean, I'd say it's almost just the sheer volume of stuff that's being made. You know, I was a journalist, a sort of film journalist before I moved into screenwriting, and when I started, the website that I wrote for didn't even really cover TV. They would do a couple of things, and you know, and now I would say it's, you know, and Hanna can probably speak to this better than I can, but it feels like almost every film critic will cover TV almost as much as they do, you know, cinema. So, you know, there's you know, I've sort of joked with friends that making TV now is a little bit like when we went to the Edinburgh Fringe, where you're just desperately trying to hand out flyers to people to be like, hey, you know, and then you look over there and Dustin Hoffman is doing has done 3 series of a show that you've never heard of, and because it's on some streaming service you've never heard of, and so yeah, it's fascinating, and I think it comes with challenges, particularly in terms of production stuff, but it's exciting as well. I think it's allowed all kinds of new voices to emerge and things like that.
Great. Hanna.
I mean, I suppose one thing I've noticed is there's far more diversity on screen than ever before. You know, I suppose one of the things I noticed, like a show like We Are Lady Parts, you know, you can't imagine of that series ever getting commissioned 10 years ago. And then even something like, you know, I cover a lot of kind of Middle East and North Africa representation on screen. And so shows like Rami or Mo more recently, like those things that are so specific about both like Middle Eastern culture, but also Muslim culture, you wouldn't get that on TV. You might get, you know, an indie film. And I think Shireen Darbis, who actually just got nominated for an Emmy for directing an episode of Only Murders in the Building, but I spoke to her recently, and she'd done these 2 films that basically kind of in the early 2010s that kind of looked at that immigrant Arab experience. And yet when, you know, Rami comes along, suddenly it's like, this is, oh my God, breakthrough. Now we're finally seeing it for the first time. So in a way, sometimes it feels like TV is giving space for more diverse writers, filmmakers, to be able to like bring stories that have obviously already been seen, but actually to a more mainstream audience, rather than getting a few, you know, might do like the Curzon cinema or get a few screens here and there. But this is like everywhere, everyone can see it. And obviously Rami on Hulu, and then it comes out, I think it's, what is it, on Stars Play, and again, that whole system of like where it gets distributed is something we'll probably talk about as well. But just being able to reach a bigger audience is something that we never have, or even something, you know, the kind of Danish series like that, like suddenly international cinema and TV has become more, I don't know, more part of our cultural conversations nowadays.
Absolutely, and I think, of course, that's also linked to the volume. There is so much out there, and all kinds of different things for different tastes, different palettes, different audiences. So we'll dig into all of those things a little bit more. Let's start with the streaming services. Obviously, Netflix, we now have many more streaming services, arguably perhaps too many. And, you know, one of the big things that Netflix ushered in was this idea of viewing on demand, rather than watching at, you know, everyone sitting down and watching at 9 o'clock on a Sunday, whatever was being served up to us on the terrestrial channels. Lisa, can you talk a little bit about sort of your observations around sort of how that has impacted audiences and that sort of this idea of streaming on demand?
Yes, well, obviously Netflix are the pioneers of the binge streaming box set of dropping all episodes at once so you can swallow up in a weekend, and then like yearn for this next series to come out next year, you know. So I think it's really interesting that actually we see more and more of the streamers adopting more flexible models around releasing episodes and around releasing series, and kind of seeing the benefits that broadcasters have had of releasing things weekly, whereby then you can have a kind of an ongoing conversation about how a series is developing, or you can split it into 2 parts, as they've been doing with Stranger Things as well. It's sort of, it's much more flexible model now than it used to be, which still makes it difficult for audiences to keep up still, as to what's being released when, and whether something is weekly or whether it's all coming all at once. It's quite difficult to track, but I mean, as we've been saying, there's kind of more and more to enjoy in that.
And what do you think the reasons are between something being released all at once and something being released weekly, or something being released in 2 parts? Is that down to creative decisions? Is that down to business decisions? Is it about retaining subscribers? What are some of those reasons?
I think it's a combination of those things, and more you listen to executives and creatives, the decisions seem to be based around the content of the series or the type of the series and what is suitable to an audience for a particular show. If they will enjoy that slow burn of a weekly episode, or if they will prefer a binge. So it's feeding into the commissioning process as well. Those kind of strategies about how things will be released.
I was going to add that, one of the things I found when I was doing more kind of coverage of, ratings, viewership and all that, obviously Netflix is very difficult to get ratings for because they're, notoriously secretive, but a lot of the conversation about like the social conversation. And actually at first when they were doing the binge, it was like whole about binging. It was all, everyone watch it as soon as you can, drop it on a Friday, you spend the whole weekend watching it. But then you had series like Altered Carbon, which was a really great series, but that it lost traction. No one was really talking about it a few days afterwards. And I think now you're seeing far more series, whether it's the Disney Plus, are pretty much doing that kind of weekly release strategy, but also doing a thing where it's like everywhere at the same time, which I quite like, because I'm like, whether I have to get up at 8 a.m. if I want to watch something without getting spoilers, and I just accept that social media is the outer rim. It's lawless. If you don't watch it, don't go on Twitter if you don't want to be spoiled when it comes to TV. I think cinema is a totally different conversation, because obviously not everyone can get to the theatrical release at exactly the same time. But you are seeing that where I think people enjoy that and you have a conversation that lasts throughout the week and then it builds up and picks up again. So I think we didn't have social media like this when, 10 years ago, 20 years ago and stuff. So even just accounting for that sort of word of mouth conversation, that's what I think they're recognizing now when it comes to releasing of series.
Ollie, so you have just had your second show launch on Disney Plus a couple of weeks back, and that went up all at once. Were there conversations in the process around how that would work?
I think there was a sort of strategy shift, I think, in that when we were commissioned, I think that the plan was to drop everything, was to do weekly releases, and I think what they weren't sure about at the time is I think just drop 3 episodes to begin with, and then they're going weekly after that. Shows have sort of different sort of rhythms to how that's been working. I think ultimately, so we were sort of making it thinking it was going to be weekly releases, and then at some point I assume that the great algorithm, sort of reported back that certain things do better when they're sort of dropped all at once, and that's how we ended up going. So yeah, it's interesting. I think I think different shows benefit from different sort of patterns. I think I think what we're finding is that from what I've been told, people are getting through wedding season quite quickly, like they're watching it in sort of a couple of sittings over a couple of nights, which I think is a good sign. Whereas something like House of the Dragon, for example, like I think it really does benefit from, as Hannah was saying, the conversation every week, that sort of water cooler sort of people going into work and being like, did you see it? Did you, all of that. Sometimes having watched it over breakfast or whatever.
That was Hannah watching it over breakfast.
Yeah. Waking up, the minute I wake up, it's like, put it on, She-Hulk, put it on. But also that's when I was working in certain places, like you'd get, because like in Game of Thrones, it used to go out in the US the day before on a Sunday night, and then on the Monday it would show in the UK, and I'd be spoiled for it. It'd be so frustrating because I'd have to write about it afterwards. So you know, that's what comes with the territory when you cover things. Sometimes you get spoiled when you don't even want to be.
And we were talking, Hanna, you were touching on this a little bit, but talking about how these changes have impacted the cultural conversation. You know, if it's not one big show on BBC every week that everyone talks about, you know, there are so many different cultural conversations that can be happening at any one time, and certain shows can just slip under the radar, and certain shows, you know, potentially, like say a Lord of the Rings, if they have an awful lot of money invested in that show being successful and popular, they have a lot of marketing weight that they can put behind it. Does it make it harder for shows to cut through? Does that make it a more sort of a sort of difficult landscape for audiences to find the things that they like?
Well, you said, you know, marketing, that plays, whether it's TV or cinema, that's like a massive thing for it. You know, I know someone who recently released Mr. Malcolm's List, which is, you know, British rom-com, anyone loves Bridgertons, they'll be like, this is perfect for them. And the marketing campaign was pretty much non-existent. And then there's also a thing where, you know, I said Station 11. I thought in America, like Station 11 was this revelatory series. Like I'd see people talking about it. They did like a kind of podcast, like as a companion piece to the series. And then because it's on Starzplay UK, which is a kind of streaming service that you can watch within your Prime membership, so it's kind of, it makes it a lot harder, and no one's really been talking about it. So when I started watching it, I was like, who's watching it in the UK? Why is no one talking about this show? So yeah, I think it kind of does depend on the streaming service. Again, Apple TV is another great example. I mean, The Morning Show, obviously, with all the starry names in that, and also maybe the bad reviews for it, people not really liking it, has created this thing that people are interested in it, and because it gets nominated for things. But then I compare it to like the series Mythic Quest, which I think is so good, or like The After Party. And you mentioned Bad Sisters, but can't really see much of the conversation on it, because I think Apple is still, I don't think as many people are as on that streaming service or have subscriptions to that, compared to like I don't know, like it's like we talk about the big three broadcasters, but now it's like the big streaming services, which is basically Netflix, Prime, and I'd say at the moment Disney Plus.
Is it also fair to say that it has changed the way people engage, journalists engage with TV, the way that sort of the cultural conversation around TV? I mean, Ollie, you were talking about sort of writing for an online platform at a time when that was still a relatively small thing, and being there sort of during the time when that exploded. Has that changed how TV is treated as an art form?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's you know, I'm heartened. I think sometimes in the UK, TV criticism has been something that you give to some, you know, a funny journalist who can say some sort of withering stuff about it, and it feels like it's being taken more seriously as an art form in the way that people like Emily Nussbaum in the US, you know, great writers like that. But I think, there's been some interesting patterns. I feel like I learned a lot about writing TV from reading AV Club recaps and Vulture, and this dates me a bit, but Television Without Pity, which was one of the first sort of sites that kind of did that sort of thing on shows like Lost. And there it felt like almost everything was covered all the time. Now it's for these sort of big pop culture sites, they physically don't have the money or the time or the people to cover every show in that level of detail. So it's always interesting to see which are the ones that break through and don't, and often it's not the ones you sort of expect it to be. I think, like, you know, it feels like when Netflix launched, House of Cards was their big sort of, you know, the big starry drawing. It was David Fincher and it was Kevin Spacey and Robin Wright, and yeah, it felt like Orange is the New Black was the one that cut through, which was the show that people weren't really expecting to. And similarly with Apple, they've had, you know, these very big budget things, and it was Ted Lasso that was the one that became the thing that won the Emmys. And this summer, I haven't been able to see it yet, but the Bear was the show that everybody in the US has been talking about. You know, to some extent up against things that are much more, had much more hype behind them in advance. But you know, it's interesting. I think good shows find an audience, I think, and the word of mouth that we were talking about, you know, that sort of weekly release can sometimes, you know, I think you can see over the course of a season, like a show going, really kind of building up momentum.
And of course, social media has made word of mouth a much speedier thing. Lisa, sort of taking the sort of the long view of sort of TV over the past few decades, what are your observations about sort of the way that kind of the culture around TV and sort of audiences and sort of internet culture has the impact that has had?
Yeah, it's enormous, obviously. I appreciated the shout out to Television Without Pity as well. I was also an aficionado. It does make it really difficult to kind of keep track of everything now. So you do kind of have to find your space. I mean, I find it's part of my job to track all of these things, and it's difficult. It's hard to bring all of those things together. I think people are kind of developing their own strategies for that. I know, you know, people keep spreadsheets of what they want to watch. It was not that way before. But when it comes to social media, that's where it's the weekly model of releasing those programs, that you can take part in those conversations, and also that idea of programs being released simultaneously across territories, so that conversation is international, whereas historically we'd have to be waiting for American TV shows to come over here.
I mean, we still are a little bit.
When
the Bear.
Yeah. It still does happen with some things, unless you have your ways and means, of course. That notion of, you know, Game of Thrones or now House of the Dragon coming out at 2 in the morning, and so you have to be right on it if you do want to be part of that conversation. But also, if professionally, if you're a critic, you have to be on it. So yeah, it feels like running to keep standing still a lot of the time.
I did some recaps for the book of Boba Fett, so it's like waking up in the morning, getting those knocked out and filing it and getting it. But it's funny because when I was first starting out, even show, it's like doing recaps and stuff. I remember watching like Big Brother and having to do a recap of what happened the night before. I feel like everyone wants to kind of like, if they don't have time to watch the series, they kind of want to know what's going on. Also, there's a big thing on, I suppose, within news outlets, is because it's all about clicks. So they'll do SEO headlines. Like when I used to write stuff for Screen Rant, when I was first transitioning into just being freelance and writing specifically about film and TV, you know, you do SEO stories and like what are the SEO phrases that are kind of people searching for, and let's create a headline out of that. And it'd be like any angle could get off. Like when Netflix had the Marvel series, I wrote countless pieces on there just for like, this is what this means, or what does this person's introduction, who are they, you know, all those type of things. But what's interesting was how I spoke to someone recently who was doing a TV show for a streamer, and they had to reshoot scenes because they had how the algorithm and like they need to have this phrase. This is a searchable phrase, so now we need to incorporate that into the plot. So they had to reshoot certain scenes so that it would come up when they do the algorithm. And I was watching, and there's a thing in there's a sort of, I had screen access for this series called The Reboot, which is a Hulu series, and there's like a whole thing about how they've got this character who was in like, you know, in research data handling. Now she's like the vice president of comedy, and she's talking about, oh, we need this actor who can't act, but she's a reality TV show star, but because she's got an audience which is like 16 to 35, we'll cast her in it rather than her being. So a lot of it feels like now we kind of seeing I don't know, Ollie can speak to this more, but like how actually now it's a case of getting the ingredients to try and like get people's attentions in a way that feels less organic than just actually writing a series that might be good. It's like, let's make sure we have all these bits going in just to get those like figures, the same way that we're trying to do in online journalism, trying to get views. It's kind of demoralizing a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and what I will say, because I definitely, we made Cheaters without a broadcaster, which is very unusual for TV. It was sort of funded by the production company and BBC Studios. So as a result, we never had sort of studio notes on it. So going from that to working with, you know, the almighty mouse, I think we were definitely concerned about what things would be, but actually they were incredibly, you know, there was you know, in that case certainly there were no questions of them coming in and saying, you know, you have to put this phrase in or you have to do anything like that. They were very sort of relaxed, but I'm sure not every streaming service is like that.
So, of course, in the way that you know, film and TV is engaged with by fans, by you know, by websites, that's just one of the ways in which the gap between film and television is closing. Lisa, can you talk a little bit about sort of what that looks like in terms of the actual content that we're watching, the shows that we're watching? I mean, the quality has gone up remarkably. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to think about what we mean when we talk about high-end television, and do we just mean budgets? Does high-end just mean expensive, or is there an aesthetic quality to that? Because a lot of these things, they particularly Marvel and Star Wars properties, they're using all the same materials you would use to make a film. Where TV comes into its own is with what TV has always had, the luxury of time. So you have a longer time to tell a story, you have more time to engage with characters, you can go off in different directions. What that means for the difference between film and TV, I think there's always space for. When we think about films, we're thinking less about a mode of release than like a single dramatic work or a single comedic work. It's a story, it's an encapsulated story in a shorter space of time. If we want to talk about TV as series and film as a singular work, I think that makes more sense to me now that, as you say, these kind of areas have collapsed into each other a little bit. Certainly in the kind of streaming environment that we're in now.
Ollie, you write across both film and TV. What are the differences for you from a writing point of view? Is it just about time? Are you able to sort of realize the vision in both spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just starting to dip my toe into film right now, and the you know, the sort of legend of being a film screenwriter is that you get treated much worse than you do as a TV writer, right? I think, but you know, I'm having a nice time so far. But you know, I think what has started to shift in the last few years, it felt that the kind of peak TV boom meant that almost everything that was, you know, and particularly with books and sort of true life stories, you were sort of starting to get, everything was almost defaulting to becoming a series or a limited series, and I think we all. Well, I don't know if we all dread, but every so often you'll hear someone be like, yeah, we approached it more as an 8-hour movie than we did as a series. I'm always like, oh no. Because I think TV is its own medium, and I think it should stand out. You know, each episode should feel like an episode. It shouldn't just be a chunk of something else. And you know, I think and there've been a couple of examples this year of you know, of some quite big shows that just felt like they didn't have enough story to sort of cover the 8 or 10 episodes that they had. In general, I think we're better. They used to be something that I would call the Netflix slump, where you'd have like some of those early shows they were making, and I think it was just because people were trying to work out that like streaming model. But you'd have a really good first episode and a really good last episode, and nothing happening in between. Just sort of people kind of talking without any actual kind of story. So yeah, but I think it's now starting to, you know, I think and partly because film is making a little bit of a comeback as well, I think people are more open to the idea of like, do you know what, if it's 2 hours, it should be 2 hours. We don't have to sort of inflate it and stretch it out to more than that.
And what does the proliferation of platforms mean for traditional broadcasters like the BBC, like Channel 4? Is there space for both in this landscape, Lisa?
I think obviously there's added competition and there's pressure on budgets. I think there's pressures in production, which I mean have been really well covered. That there are shortages in crews and studio space and things like that. But I also think there is. It's not all bad for the broadcasters, and the broadcasters do work with the streamers as well. And I think that gets forgotten, that they do co-productions, they do work together and turn out some really great things. I mean, Amazon Studios was a co-producer on Small Axe, for instance. There are opportunities there as well for the broadcasters. And the other thing is with public service broadcasters in the UK, the programs that they turn out, which maybe they don't get covered quite as much in the kind of cultural zeitgeist, but they're still pulling in really big audiences. They're still really, really important to people. So it's just it's a bigger ecosystem than it was, I think, rather than seeing it all as pressure on the broadcasters. I think they might say the same as well, and that there's opportunities there. Of course, it's then difficult when the broadcasters make really successful shows and then the talent kind of goes off to streamers to make something.
And what does this wider ecosystem mean for creatives, Ollie? Is it just about there are more places to sell your shows to? Is it entirely a positive thing? Is there any elements where if there is competition for audiences, and if a show's not working and it gets cancelled, does it also mean that it's a more brutal landscape?
Yeah, I mean, a bit of both, I think. I'm a deeply anxious person, so I've always been waiting for the bubble to burst at some point. But for the minute it's kept on going, and and I think it is, I can't really speak to what it was like pitching a show 10 years ago, but essentially the impression I get is that if BBC said no, you take it to Channel 4 and maybe you take it to Sky after that, and that was it. And now that there are all kinds of places and all kinds of and I think there's also and something that's stretched back to something like Borgen 10 years ago, but obviously with Squid Game now being as big a TV show as there ever was. And that's another example of something where that just really came from nowhere and became this huge word of mouth hit. And so I think that means that studios and streamers are more ready to accept sort of shows from different cultures being able to sort of be sold elsewhere and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think things are starting to, I think there might be a bit of contraction coming. This year was the first time that Netflix lost subscribers, and I think there's been a sort of tightening of belts on from across the industry, really. People going, okay, we need to sort of take a breath and maybe not spend to the degree that which we've been spending. At the same time, there's still a huge demand for I nearly said content, and I hate the word content in the context of this, but stuff, let's call it stuff. So and I think there's still some degree to which numbers, the number of people watching a show is not the only thing that can sort of lead to it being renewed. And again, we talked about kind of completion rates of a show, which I know more than one streamer is sort of value that almost more highly than literally the number of people watching it. It's to what extent are you engaging? Are you staying on the service? Are you things like that?
I also feel like you mentioned the contraction, and I feel like we've seen that already, like a lot. I mean, there's I always think with Netflix, wasn't there a whole thing where they'll do 4 series and done, but then you see 4 seasons and done, and then I see something like Archive 81, which was like critically acclaimed across the board, and then they cancelled it after the final episode, and you're like, oh right. And then you look at the kind of other TV series that have also been cancelled, and a lot of them were female-led or minority-led, but you have something like, sorry if anyone likes Emily in Paris, but like that was a TV show that people said wasn't that great, But obviously it's that sort of kind of sweet spot for Netflix where they've got this kind of very long run of like what I call like Hallmark movie TV series, where it's about the kind of mediocre rom-coms that people just like to watch. I feel like they're hungover films. Like I just need a slight like manufactured sugary rush and like that's it. So I feel sometimes, as much as these streaming services can be amazing, give these opportunities, it's like, where's the longevity of it? Like how much are they investing in it? How much are they allowing for a series that might not get the most, like be as like, oh God, like 4-quadrant, like appeal to every single demographic? Can we still have it survive? Because a very core, like you said, if there's a core fan base or it's a very specific thing that's breaking the mold, can we actually invest and let it run its course rather than, you know, cut and running because it didn't quite hit the way we wanted to? You know, I've always found it odd when Netflix like, oh, we count a viewing if it's like, what, 2 minutes? Someone's watched it for 2 minutes. And so you kind of like want to, this is again, I'd love to know the actual data figures for some of these places so we can actually know who is actually watching it. Because I think they said about the Terminal List, that series on Amazon Prime, I think they're saying, oh yeah, it got this many like billions of minutes. And you're like, well, let's break that down. That's actually not as good as you think it is. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's so much information out there that we haven't got, that we can't really make a very, I suppose, educated guess or educated kind of observation, because there is still a lot of secrecy behind the scenes about what's going on and you know, what's the gatekeeping going on too.
I was just going to say, I suspect that one of the things that is going to change in the next year or two is Netflix and Disney are both introducing the sort of ad-supported tier, where it'll be a bit cheaper and you have to watch a few ads. And I suspect that that's something that they'll have to start disclosing some of the data and some of the viewing figures, because advertisers will want to know how many people are watching a show and things like that. So that could be an interesting kind of shift to come.
Yeah, definitely. What I was going to say is, with all of those things that Hannah was talking about, it is the case that the companies have more information about viewers than ever before, how long we watch something, the kinds of things we watch, and then also what people say about it on social media. There are all kinds of different things that can feed into their decision-making process, and yet still we don't really understand it. So as Ollie says, it will be interesting to see how ad-supported services have to engage with that a bit more and make that information available.
For sure. And we'll come on to a sec. In a minute, we will sort of round up with some of our predictions of where we think things go from here. But before we do, we had the Emmys a couple of weeks back. How important are awards and sort of prizes for TV in the streaming landscape, where, you know, a show like Emily in Paris, for example, can find its audience without sort of critical or awards success?
Well, it did get a Golden Globe nomination, but we don't really put much stock in Golden Globes anymore. I think these award shows are really kind of important, because, you know, just say, you know, TV BAFTAs or something, people might tune in, whether they're looking at Twitter to see who the winners are, you know, media outlets are all covering it. And there you've got a ready-made list of the best so-called best TV series on available right now and telling you where to go. So I do think it does help. And also it does help for, I suppose, people. I'm seeing a lot of people, actors and filmmakers, go from TV and then be able to make their first feature, you know. I think or get their first like lead acting role. So I do think there is still stock in it, but I think that we have very much got this quite old school, very white centric way makeup of these memberships, these bodies who get to vote and decide. You know, it's interesting to see in the Emmys, I think it was like the first Black woman in 35 years to ever win a comedy award, and I forgive me, I forgot her name, but she's in Abbott Elementary, which is amazing. But you know, to have that, to have these kind of like still these firsts going on, you have to kind of think about like who is choosing what's the best. And yeah, it can be, you know, quite typical, the old frame of mind of like, yeah, we'll nominate maybe a few diverse people, but ultimately it will be the mostly white shows that win.
We've heard a lot about sort of streaming fatigue and audiences struggling to manage all their multiple subscriptions, particularly with a cost of living crisis, certainly in the UK, looming. Lisa, do you have a sense of what that might mean for audiences and for streaming platforms over the next couple of years? Have we reached sort of peak subscription?
I think it's important to say that COVID had a big impact on this as well, and COVID really drove up subscriptions for all of the streamers, I think, and Disney Plus kind of launched it at just the right moment in the UK to kind of get people when everyone was locked down and having more time to watch everything. And so I think it's quite natural that we see those numbers coming down now because it was kind of saturated to a certain point. And then, as Ollie says, the companies are reacting to this by bringing in ad-supported services. So they will be cheaper and they will be ad-supported. And I think all the major streamers will be doing that very soon.
Hanna and Ollie, any sort of final thoughts about where we go from here? Obviously, we've talked about ad-supported streaming platforms. Any other, if you're sort of looking into your crystal balls, what sort of shifts do you think come over the next couple of years?
Well, I reckon we're going to get even more reboots and rehashed IP. I mean, I think we're getting Interview with a Vampire soon. The Vampire Academies. I mean, I do love hot vampires, so this is very much in my wheelhouse. I love it, but I think we're going to see that even more. Going to see even more of this crossover between cinema and TV releases, increasing that web narrative. And I kind of feel like we're also going to go back. I feel at some point with streaming services, they're going to offer a bundle. Like, you know how like Sky TV, Sky cable service, like, oh, you can get all these channels and this is what you pay a month. I wouldn't be surprised if streamers suddenly realize like they're not doing it individually. The best way they can get people to watch the shows is say you can get five streaming services for this amount of month, and there you go. So I kind of see that's the way it's going to go forward.
It feels like at some point we're going to lose a service or two, and whether that's because an Amazon or an Apple are like, do you know what, actually this isn't our main business, like it's too much trouble, and going to the Emmys once a year isn't worth it, or whether it's out, and we've already had the Disney and Fox merger, but whether someone tries to buy Netflix or a couple Peacock and HBO Max merge or whatever. It does feel that there'll be a little bit of shrinking. I'm sort of interested to know whether the sort of appetite for franchisey stuff is sustainable. Like, it feels like, IP is the best way to cut through, but does Marvel start to feel a little bit special when you have something, feel less special when you have something dropping every 6 weeks, or certainly until Andor, which I loved, I was feeling a little bit Star Wars sort of fatigued. So, but I think people have been saying that about movies for 20 years, and it's the appetite for sort of IP stuff keeps growing. So I wouldn't necessarily hold my breath on that one, but yeah.
Well, I'd love to finish, as we finish up now, I'd love to ask each of you to just let us know one thing that you're looking forward to over the rest of the year. Lisa, is there one particular thing that you're looking forward to?
Next series of The Crown.
Me too. Ollie, what are you looking forward to?
I'm very excited for the English. I think Hugo Blick is a talent that we don't sort of have many people like him in the UK as a kind of proper like TV auteur, and so he's got this Emily Blunt Western series coming out, which I'm very excited to see.
Which is showing at LFF.
Which world premieres at LFF. Thank you.
And I suppose one thing I will say about the kind of TV and film kind of feeding each other, there are so many indie filmmakers and directors who takes them years to just finance a project. It can take 5 years or something to make a movie. So being able to kind of like, again, I mentioned Shireen Davis, but she's been able to do work on Ozark or only murders in the building, and that's been a place where she's been able to work on her craft and, you know, keep her directing muscle going in between. So the fact that there are more opportunities, especially for people who are come from marginalized identities, they may be able to like continue working, whereas cinema obviously doesn't provide that that space more as frequently to be able to make great quality content or stuff, as we say. But to be able to do that, I think that's really important, especially as, you know, again, you know, not everyone can get to the cinema, and as much as I adore this theatrical experience, like, people are living these lives nowadays and they can't afford it all. So I feel like we should always be striving to have television offerings to be as good, as prestigious as what you see on the big screen. So I can only hope that the quality will not dip in favor of quantity, which I do think at the moment in certain cases the quality has dipped just for the sake of getting the quantity of things out there to be watched.
Great. And is there anything particular that you are excited about?
I mean, I don't know when it's out, but yeah, but Abbott Elementary second season, it's already started in the US, and this is really annoying because I really want to watch now. Rami season 3, and I don't know when Yellow Jacket's coming back, but I need that in my life. It's so good.
Yeah, I am particularly excited about Happy Valley coming back in the foreseeable future, and also The Bear, which we talked about earlier, and which launches here beginning of October. So, as you say, Lisa, we could have talked for another couple of hours about all the shows that we are watching and loving. I would recommend a great podcast called The Watch from The Ringer, if you are interested in that sort of thing. And if you are also interested in the crossover between film and television, I would recommend the LFF's new series programme. Thank you, Ollie, for mentioning the English, which is our special presentation this year. Thank you so much, Hannah, Ollie, Lisa. This was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.